Doron, welcome, my friend.
Thank you.
I'm excited for you to be here for a bunch of reasons, but particularly because we had Pete Evans on last week, that most people will know, celebrity chef and paleo warrior, but also a very divisive figure. And I love the guy. He looks healthy. He's peaceful. He seems spiritually aligned and things, but he's got a lot of naysayers, a lot of haters. And there was a lot of conversation on some of our social platforms last week. And so I'm going to be very curious to see whether some of the science that we talk about today, or you talk about today, and I listen to, aligns with some of Pete's philosophy. But I'd love to start, Doron, with you, because you're an orthopedic physician. Just your history outside of, where you studied and how you got into orthopedics, and then the connection with nutrition and what you're doing in that space.
Yeah, look, firstly, thanks for having me here. It's a great pleasure to be here with you guys. Starting in orthopedic surgery, I went into medicine really to do orthopedic surgery. I'd broken, 11 or 12 bones by the time I was 10 years old, and so it was a fairly natural progression into orthopedics for me. I did some overseas fellowship training in the US, in Italy, in Canada. I trained in Australia, did all my medical school stuff in Australia, and then did subspecialty training here as well. So I'm an orthopedic surgeon as opposed to a physician.
Okay.
And I mainly do knee, shoulder, and elbow surgery. And I guess part of the foray into how I got into this whole nutrition stuff was dealing with some of my knee patients. And I had a whole lot of young patients, in their 50s who were massively overweight, coming in saying, my knee's terribly painful, will you do a knee replacement for me? And my problem as a surgeon is I know that the complication rate for knee replacements is much higher in young patients and much higher in overweight patients. So I wanted to not do the knee replacement, but I didn't have a solution for them, because I kept saying to them, go and lose weight. And they'd come back and say, look, I've tried to lose weight, I can't lose weight. And so this was my dilemma. I didn't want to do the surgery, but I didn't have a decent solution for them.
Yeah, interesting.
So then one of my assistants is a sports medicine physician, Paul Mason, who I know you know of.
Yeah.
And he and I were chatting, it was about 4 years ago now, and he was saying to me, look, there's this good science coming out that we can help people lose weight by changing their eating habits. And I was a bit skeptical about it, and I said, oh, look, if you do that, you're going to kill the people. So he said,
why did you say that though?
Well, just because my training, everybody's training, everyone's scared of fat, right?
Yeah.
You know that cholesterol causes heart disease and kills you, and that's what everybody's taught.
We thought that cholesterol killed you. I'm not sure we still believe that.
So that's what I'm saying. So this is where I was 4 years ago.
Yeah. But can I ask just on that, and my mum and dad were both medical doctors. My brother's a medical doctor, and I say this with the greatest of respect, but the amount of nutrition training that you get in medical school is minimal to none, yeah?
Correct. So it's negligible. But everyone in society still believes the same paradigm, that, cholesterol causes heart disease and heart disease kills you, right? So this is where we're at. So Paul was talking to me saying, this is the diet, and I'm saying to him, well, okay, show me the science. Convince me as a scientist that what I'm about to embark on and treat my patients with isn't going to kill me and isn't going to kill them. Yeah. And he did. He showed me the science, and I spent the next 6 months learning all the stuff that I didn't know, reading all the books, reading, Ludwig and Perlmutter and all of these other scientists, Tim Noakes, voraciously reading as much of the science as I could. Not the internet stuff, not the Google stuff, but the actual science.
Hardcore science.
Yeah, the
peer-reviewed research.
Correct. And Paul convinced me. And then when I did the science, I was convinced myself. Now, my wife has been, low carb for 12, 14 years. She'd been in my ear the whole time about it. And I kept saying, look, that's fine, but I think it's dangerous, because that was what I was
Were you, until
taught.
that point, a very traditional food pyramid kind of guy?
100%. Look, I always ate, salad, veggies, fish, meat, because that's what I enjoyed eating anyway.
And you're a healthy guy, and you worked in
exercise,
sport.
That's right. So it wasn't like I was eating a lot of donuts and things like that anyway,
Yeah.
just because it didn't sit well with me. But so Paul convinced me of the science. I read the science myself, and I said to him, look, firstly, I'm going to try this on myself and my family. And we did that. And my brother lost 40 kilograms in weight.
From what weight to what weight?
140 down to 100
Holy
kilos.
shit. In over what period of time?
About 8 months.
Incredible.
8 to 12 months.
Has he kept it off?
Absolutely.
How
has.
long later?
It's nearly 3 years now.
Yeah.
And
Good for
he's
him.
exercising better. He's feeling fitter, healthy than he ever has beforehand.
Yeah.
You know, my mum lost 6 or 8 kilos. My dad lost about 8 or 9 kilos. I didn't change my body weight much, but my body shape changed completely. I had to get a whole new wardrobe because my pants were loose on me, even though my body shape was different. My body weight was the same.
Did you do testing on yourself before you started and after from both a blood and the DEXA scan perspective?
Not DEXA, but the blood tests constantly. I keep testing myself every 6-12 months to see what's happening.
Give me some of the headline numbers before and after that really convinced you as a scientist, let alone a human being, that what you were doing was really powerful.
So my numbers weren't particularly unhealthy at the beginning.
Sure.
So one of the things we can talk about is the omega-6 to 3 ratio.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically omega-6 are very pro-inflammatory versus omega-3s are very anti-inflammatory. And the standard Australian diet gives you about 15 to 1 of your omega-6 to 3 ratio. And that's very unhealthy because a natural diet from many years ago was close to 1 to 1.
Yeah.
You can't get rid of omega-6s completely, and you shouldn't be getting rid of omega-6s completely because we need them to build our cell walls. But our diet is very, very much higher in omega-6s than it should be. So seed oils, the vegetable oils, grain-fed, whether it's meat, poultry, whatever it is, farm-grown fish, all of these things are much higher in omega-6s than they should be.
Yeah.
And we know that as you drop that omega-6 to 3 ratio, your risk of having rheumatoid arthritis, asthma, any of these things massively drops. And so my brother's an asthmatic. He couldn't eat fish. He couldn't eat dairy. As we got him off the omega-6s, got him down with a much lower omega-6 to 3 ratio, he can now have dairy and fish, which used to create asthma attacks for him. So it's very, very powerful dietary alterations.
Incredible.
So my omega-6 to 3 ratio was about 3 to 1, which, compared to a standard diet, 15 to 1 is fantastic.
And you did get that through blood work?
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. I'm now down to 1.2 to 1. So I'm as close to sort of the old natural diets as what we possibly
And nothing
can
else changed, because this is the thing that I'm always conscious of, is that people quote studies and different things, but they don't just change their diet. They change their exercise. They change their sleep. They change their stress levels. Am I right, because it seems to be the case, that you didn't change anything primarily other than your diet?
No, nothing else has changed for me at all.
Yeah.
I'm sleeping less. I've got, because of work and other commitments. So in fact, probably my stress levels and sleep levels are worse than what they were beforehand. And yet I'm, fitter and healthier than what I was beforehand.
How old are you now? 50, 51?
Yep.
Yep. Same vintage. Yeah. You look damn good, man.
Oh, that's good genetics and my mother, you see.
And the food.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
a loving wife.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, my triglycerides dropped a little bit. My HDL, which is the good cholesterol, went up a bit. My LDL has risen, but we actually do within the clinic that we run subfractions, and it's important to understand that LDL generally is a calculated number. So that's LDL-C, calculated LDL.
Yeah.
It's not a real number, and we now understand that it's not as simple as just what your LDL is in terms of heart disease. It's the subfraction, it's the particle size. The big LDLs are actually not dangerous at all from a cardiac risk perspective, but the 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 LDLs, because there's 7 subfractions, it's those really the 5, 6, 7 ones that we really need to be very careful of, because that's oxidized LDL or damaged LDL, and those are the particles that cause the heart disease. And so tracking all of that, my LDL 1 and 2 have risen, but my 4, 5, 6, 7 have not risen at all. They're zero, and they have been zero the whole time. Yeah. So I'm not at all worried about the fact that my LDL has risen, because my triglycerides are lower, my HDL is higher, my triglyceride to HDL ratio is better, and these are all the protective things from a cardiac risk perspective.
Yeah, I get it. Why, and I've spoken to Paul about this before, why has mainstream medicine been so slow in changing like metrics like cholesterol as a classic example, that at best people will say HDL and LDL, but no one I know outside of people that work in this space know the subsets of LDL, and that just because your LDL is higher doesn't mean you're necessarily unhealthy. And similarly with weight or BMI or all those really crude metrics that really don't mean anything until you dig below the surface. Why has it been slow in changing? So slow in changing, in fact.
Yeah, so that's a really complex answer, and you can go into all sorts of conspiracy theories and people protecting the dollar and protecting their turf. And
is there an element of that though?
Look, I think there has to be. If you've spent your last 30 years as a cardiologist telling people that this is truth, to have your whole world turned around in 5 minutes and you'd have to undo all the stuff that you've done over the last 30 years, I think that would be a hard thing to do. You know, for me as a surgeon, if someone came along and said, look, you've actually harmed people doing this particular operation for the last 30 years, you should have been doing it differently. It's hard to make a change like that. But there's all sorts of overlays, because there's a whole lot of government bodies which have recommendations of a particular type, and that is very, very slow to change. There's vested interests. It's a complex answer, and I think the groundswell is going to need to come from the people, because the coming from the top down is going to be very, very, very slow. And it'll happen, but it might take 50 years. Yeah,
get it. But there definitely is a groundswell.
Correct.
You know, I certainly have seen, even over the course of the last 5 years, that whether it's people like you on the science side or people like Pete on the influencer side, that people are starting to listen. And even if they're on one side of the fence as opposed to the other, it doesn't seem to matter, because they're starting to question what they eat and what they don't eat. And, you know, and who was it that I was speaking to? It may even have been Pete last week, and talking about veganism, that for most people it's very hard to get an optimal diet being a pure vegan unless you're unbelievably knowledgeable. But people try it for a period of time, whether it's because they're concerned about animal cruelty or the environment or their own health. And even if they change, they typically come back to a far healthier place than where they started from. So therefore, it's a good result. And I think the whole dialogue around health and having knowledgeable people through platforms like this is starting to change people far faster than what happened 10, 20 years ago.
I agree. And, you know, the internet's been fantastic for that. But, sorry. One of the things to understand is that it's a space that we actually don't know that much about. You know, we haven't been doing LDL subfractions for 30 years, so we can't give you a 30-year outcome from that. So even in the last 4 or 5 years, the science has changed and is evolving. And to say that we know everything now is absolutely incorrect. We definitely don't know everything now, and we may find that some of our recommendations now need some tweaking and need some changing over the next 5 or 10 years.
Yeah, of course.
So we also have to move slowly. We can't make mass recommendations for everybody, because different people have different health levels. You know, if you're metabolically unwell, you may need one type of diet, and if you're metabolically well,
what does
you
that
may
mean,
need another.
What does metabolically unwell mean?
Okay, so somebody that has a degree of insulin resistance. I mean, you understand what insulin resistance is.
I do.
So, I mean, I guess just for a 2-minute background for some of your listeners, insulin is a very important hormone to get glucose into muscles and liver, which is very important for our energy levels. Insulin is also a fat storage hormone. So if your muscles and liver are full, insulin drives glucose out of your blood into the fat cells. Why does it do that? Because glucose in your blood is dangerous. High glucose levels lead to these things called AGEs, or advanced glycated end products, which bind with protein and damage the protein. And that's the problem, is that the protein damage is what leads to the problems. So the body knows that, wants to get the glucose out of the blood, pours out all the insulin.
Yeah.
After a while of having high glucose loads, the insulin gets higher and higher and higher, and eventually it's a bit, I guess, like if you walk into a room that's got a bad smell in it. When you first walk in, you go, "Ooh, that's really strong," but after a while, you kind of get used to it. The body gets used to having the high insulin levels, and the muscle and the liver then say, "Okay, look, I'm not going to accept any more glucose because I'm full," and all the glucose then goes into fat cells, and then people become fatter. Now, if you're somebody that already has insulin resistance, every single time you eat any glucose, it's just driven straight into your fat cells. So you only need to eat a tiny bit of glucose as a metabolically unwell person with insulin resistance to end up quite fat. Whereas somebody that doesn't have the insulin resistance can probably tolerate quite a few more carbohydrates and glucose and not end up at the same problem. And as an 18-year-old or 20-year-old, you might sit on the couch and eat a whole bag of chips and not put on any weight. Suddenly, as a 40-year-old, you eat that same bag of chips, and all of a sudden you start stacking on the weight because you've now got some insulin resistance.
Yep, get it.
Now, the problem is we're giving kids sugar all of the time. Every day of their lives, sugar, sugar, sugar. They are going to start getting insulin resistance when they're 18 and 20. And that's
Are we seeing that?
We are, absolutely. The obesity epidemic in kids is becoming rampant, and it's because of this. And so now, you know, we're in our age group, it's kind of happening when people get into their 40s and 50s, but it's going to start happening 10 to 20 years earlier with the generation that's coming through now.
It's going to be crippling. Talk a little bit more for me about this N=1 or personalized approach to nutrition, because I think one of the things that a lot of people do is they read the literature, you know, typically not the scientific literature, but they read it in a health magazine or a blog or something, and they go, I'm going to adopt that. How should people go about getting proper advice for themselves, whether they're metabolically healthy or metabolically unhealthy or otherwise, and regardless of age? What's the approach for them?
So I think there's two different groups. If you're somebody that is on medication, I don't think you should do this by yourself, particularly if you're on blood pressure drugs and diabetes drugs. I think you need to see a doctor that knows what they're doing and should be fully supervised by that doctor. Yeah. Don't try this at home kind of thing.
How do you find that doctor, though? Because it's not your typical GP.
Yeah. So, you know, I don't want to plug our clinic too much, but what I can say is, you know, what we do is we run a metabolic, arthritis and weight loss clinic. We have one in Randwick, one in Concord. You know, we've set up a website, lowcarbdoctors.com.au. Yeah. Paul Mason is the main doctor. We have another doctor joining us. And the plan is for us to be able to, you know, help more people by treating them this way. So I'll come back to your individualized approach in a minute, but the number of patients that we're seeing, there's some patients that don't need us. If you're pretty fit and healthy and all you want to do is actually improve your life, if you cut out processed foods, if you can look at a food and understand what it is by looking at it, then you're already better off than someone that's eating food out of a packet.
Of course.
If you can get rid of the seed oils and vegetable oils and change to things like olive oil and coconut oil, you've gotten rid of a lot of your omega-6s already. So changes like that everybody can do without medical supervision. If you're metabolically unwell and you need to do things like ketone testing, blood sugar testing, you're probably best off doing that with the help of a medical doctor. Yeah. But if you're not that unwell, again, these are things that you can do by yourself. We have a whole bunch of videos on our website teaching people the science behind it, and then they can do things like ketone testing or continuous blood glucose monitoring if they want to, so that they can experiment. What works for me? can I have that piece of toast? Well, the person with massive insulin resistance, no, you can't have that piece of toast anymore. Somebody that's exercising well, doesn't have too much insulin resistance, sure, once in a while you can have that piece of toast. Understand there's about 3 teaspoons of sugar in your piece of toast.
Yeah.
And that, you know, it depends what your goal is. Is your goal health? Is your goal weight loss? Is your goal exercise? Because we have some very high performance athletes coming into our clinic looking for improvements in their outcomes with marathon running or long distance swimming or things like that.
Yeah.
So it's very individualized, and you really have to pick what you're looking for from your dietary change.
Sure. Can I dig just a little bit deeper though, when you say that if you're a healthy individual, you probably don't need the assistance of someone? My mum died of Alzheimer's. My dad now has Alzheimer's. Do you think for people with a genetic predisposition to certain illnesses or a family history of certain illnesses, even if they're healthy, you know, ostensibly healthy, that adopting a program like this and getting guidance and measuring things like your inflammatory markers and things is a prudent thing to do?
Look, I think it's a clever thing to do, but I don't have the science to show you that it works.
Yeah.
Now, we're collecting data now, and we believe that it works, but that's different from proving that it works.
How do you prove it outside of like double-blind studies and those kinds of things?
Well, nutrition science, and I use that, you know, if you could see, I was using inverted commas around the word science because nutrition science is very, very vague. And so generally what they do is get, 100,000 people and follow them for a period of time and try and work out what they've eaten. To actually do a 20-year study controlling what people eat on a daily level is almost impossible.
And everything else that they do too, because this is
Correct.
the problem, isn't it? You can study one thing, but without the holistic view of what else they're doing, then it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. And this is some of the stuff that, and we'll talk a lot about meat in a minute, that I've seen, that the studies on meat seem to be very myopic, that people that eat red meat or eat processed meat are more predisposed to cancer, diabetes, whatever it happens to be, but it doesn't take into account whether those people smoked, whether they didn't exercise, whether they had jobs they didn't like, wives, husbands that they didn't love, and all those kinds of factors.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the arguments is that, every time you see a fire, there's a whole lot of firefighters there, right? So does that mean if you got rid of the firefighters, you wouldn't have fires anymore? So this is the causal link. So, people that eat a lot of the processed red meat are often people that eat it as a burger. So was it the carbohydrate in the burger? In the bread roll, was that the problem, or was the meat the problem? Was it that they were eating, were they smoking while they were eating the burger? Are they people that really only eat pizza and burgers and things like that, where, again, it's a high carb load and in fact has nothing to do with the red meat at all?
Yeah.
And then was it the combination of the fact that they were having the fat combined with the carbohydrate and the protein together that was a problem? Whereas if they had the protein and the fat without the carbohydrate, maybe it wouldn't be a problem. So to tease out those sorts of details is really, really difficult.
Yeah. So I completely agree with that. Is the proof in the pudding? Like insofar as, and let's use my friend Pete Evans again, that, and it's contradictory, N=1, personalized approach to health, nutrition, and those things is important. But can you, by looking at people and what they do, almost ignoring the science, and I know you can't, you're a doctor and a scientist, but is that not as compelling as any research paper to actually look at people and what they do, and without going to the granular detail, applying the macro approaches that they're doing?
I think you have to be a little bit careful of that because different people do things differently. So, what can I tell you about my patients? So I can tell you that patients that were lining up for a knee replacement have been treated with this dietary change, have lost massive amounts of weight, anything from 10 to 70 kilograms, and then have come back to me and said, okay, well, my knee's not sore anymore. I don't need my knee replacement anymore.
That's an ethical doctor.
Yeah, but so they'll come back eventually because they've still got the arthritis, and the arthritis will get worse with time. But hopefully now, instead of being 50, they're going to be 60 or 65.
Yeah.
Not only that, their anesthetic's going to be safer because they're not obese and overweight. The infection risk is going to be lower. The prosthesis is going to last longer. So from my perspective, it's just a win-win situation. The patient does much better. Now, even if they come back to me and say, my knee's still sore, I still want to have the knee replacement, it doesn't matter because anesthetically and medically, they're better off than what they were beforehand. And I think that's the case with most people in society. If they made some dietary changes where they got rid of processed foods, they got rid of the sugar, they generally would be healthier anyway. Even if they didn't go to the extreme of a ketogenic diet, even if they didn't massively change their omega-6 to 3 ratios, they're still going to be better off. Now, I still think there's degrees. I still think the more you do, the better off you're going to be. But even small changes like those for the general population across the board will make a massive difference. Now, is that ideal? No, it's not ideal. The ideal is to go all the way and do it really, really properly. But even small changes will help.
Make a difference. For those that don't know, and increasingly this pool of people is less and less, but ketogenic diet, what are the fundamentals?
The fundamentals are to use ketones as your fuel source.
Which are, for us non-scientific people?
Yeah, so basically at a mitochondrial level. So if you drill down into a cell and you're looking kind of at the furnace of the cell, where does our energy come from? That's called the mitochondria. And the mitochondria can either burn glucose or ketones to produce energy for us. And we all understand what glucose is because we understand sugar is glucose and we can eat it.
Yeah.
Ketones are a little bit dark and mysterious to understand, but basically they're a product that's made by the liver that can circulate in the blood and get deposited into cells for the mitochondria to burn. Now, the standard person burns about half fatty acids and half glucose in their day-to-day life.
Yeah.
That's, somebody that's not changed their diet at all, eating a standard Australian high-carbohydrate diet. If you now start to restrict the carbohydrates, and how much you restrict is a very individual thing depending on how metabolically unwell it is. And a high-performance athlete, they might be 150 grams of carbohydrates. Somebody that's diabetic, you might drop them down to 25 or 50 grams of carbohydrates.
And so that's any carbohydrate?
All carbohydrates.
Yeah.
That's total carbohydrates for that 24-hour period. So, we can talk about complex carbohydrates in a minute if you like. So what happens is the body needs fuel from somewhere. And because it's not getting glucose, it needs fuel from somewhere else.
Yeah.
So there's a process called the TCA cycle, and oxaloacetate is the rate-limiting step in the TCA cycle. When you're not eating glucose, you need to make your own glucose through a product called gluconeogenesis, because some cells do need glucose. Like your brain needs a certain amount of it, your red blood cells need a certain amount of it. But the body is perfectly capable of making as much glucose as it needs. So in making its own glucose, it uses up oxaloacetate. Oxaloacetate then becomes depleted, so you can't make the energy in the TCA cycle. So your body then goes into something called beta oxidation and makes fatty acids. Fatty acids get turned into these ketones, and then the ketones are what provides your energy source. So that's where ketogenic diet means I'm eating so little carbohydrate that my body will make its own ketones to supply energy for me.
And to fuel you.
Correct.
And the difference between exogenous ketones and intrinsic, if that's the right word, for the ones we produce versus things like MCT oil?
So we make 3 different types of ketones. Ketones that are sent out through the urine, through the breath, and then stay in the blood to stay as energy. The body is designed to have ketones in the presence of low insulin and low glucose. All right. So now if you take an exogenous ketone and drink it, and you're not in ketosis, you've now got insulin and glucose as well as ketones. Number one, all you're going to do is put on weight because you're not going to burn the ketones effectively because you're burning glucose anyway.
Got it.
And number two, we don't know what the side effects of that are going to be in the long term. Maybe that's going to be dangerous for your health to have the combination of ketones, glucose, and insulin, because up to now, the ketones only came around when there was low glucose and low insulin.
Got it. The impact of whether it's intermittent fasting or more prolonged fasting with getting into ketosis, how beneficial is it? What are some of the challenges around it? What should people be aware of?
So intermittent fasting is not a term I actually like, because I think what we need to understand is when we're hungry and when we're not.
But is that physically or psychologically hungry? Because I think there's a fundamental difference, yeah?
Correct. And 5 years ago, I had no idea when I was hungry or when I wasn't. I just ate because it was breakfast, lunch, or dinner time.
Yeah, which is the vast majority of Westerners.
Correct. It took me 6 or 8 months of being on a ketogenic diet to actually appreciate when I was hungry. And Paul talks about the cheese test. You know, if you go to the fridge and you open up the fridge and you go, I'm hungry, okay, I'm going to have a piece of cheese because it's going to fill me up. And you say, okay, look, I open up the fridge, I don't really feel like the cheese. I'm actually feeling like maybe having some fruit, or I'm feeling like having a piece of toast, or I'm having a piece of chocolate. What you're doing then is snacking. You're not actually hungry. You're looking for a taste sensation rather than to fill you up.
Yeah,
now, again, there's nothing necessarily wrong with that, but eating just for the sake of it is wrong. So I eat sometimes once a day, sometimes twice a day. And if I'm hungry, I'll eat more. But I actually know now, I can appreciate when I'm hungry and when I'm just looking to put something in my mouth from a taste perspective.
Yeah, got it. What else happens in the body though? And I know you don't like the word intermittent fasting, but what else happens metabolically in your body with intermittent fasting?
Okay, so if you go to bed, if you eat dinner at 7 or 8 o'clock at night and then you go to sleep and you wake up at 8 o'clock the next morning, if you like, that's an intermittent fast. You've gone 12 hours without eating anything. So you'll deplete the amount of glycogen in your body. So glycogen is the storage form of glucose. If you bunch a whole lot of glucose together and store them as glycogen, that can be stored in your muscle and in your liver. And then as you need the glucose, the body can release that glycogen. But you've only got a certain amount of glycogen stores. After a while, your glycogen runs out, and then your body starts to naturally produce ketones. So even in people that aren't fat adapted, that is what will happen to them if they don't eat for long enough. So if you intermittent fast, if it's 12, 18, 24 hours, you will go into a fat-burning state, even if you are someone that eats glucose on a regular basis.
Yeah. What about from a cognitive perspective?
Look, again, the science isn't there. We can only talk about the N equals 1 and what people tell us. Ketones have a lot of beneficial effects from both health, psychology, healing, perspectives. There's a lot of benefits that people talk about. People talk about once your ketone levels get above 1, that you sort of get this amazing clarity of thought. One of the other side effects of ketones, it tends to suppress your appetite. So as your ketones go up, you want to eat less anyway, so it's easier to fast for longer. So as you get into ketosis, your fast actually becomes easier. I know that if I've got a particularly important presentation to do, I will naturally fast because I don't want heavy feelings of food in my stomach kind of slowing me down and my thought processes. And for me to go 24 or 36 hours without food is easy as long as I'm maintaining my fluids.
How regularly would you do that?
Look, if I've got a big operating day and, starting at 7 o'clock in the morning and finishing at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, I'll do that easily. I'll just have a few drinks during the day, but I won't actually stop for a meal.
Yeah, non-alcoholic, I'm assuming.
Yeah, that's right. I just, have something like bouillon or bone broth or something with salt in it.
Yeah, okay.
Because salt is very, very important.
Yep. What about that myth, and I use that word because it's my belief, I'm not saying it is right or wrong, that by not eating for that period that people's metabolism slows down. That whole thing of if you eat 3 meals a day, 5 meals a day, then you're going to naturally lose weight. That theory seems to have been thrown out the window.
Oh, it's completely been disproven. This is super complex. There's a hormone called insulin, there's a hormone called leptin, and there's about another 8 or 9 factors, including ghrelin, all of which affect satiety and hunger. And there's a very, very complex interplay between them. And as you become insulin resistant or leptin resistant, your response to what you eat and when you get hungry and when you don't all becomes very, very a complex interplay between them. But fasting for, short periods of time, 16, 18 hours, has no effect on your metabolism from that perspective at all, and is only potentially beneficial because you can get the added benefits of perhaps rejuvenating and regenerating your cells, which doesn't happen when you're eating all the time. There's another product called mTOR. So you could spend 2 or 3 hours just on that topic and still not have it completely sorted out as to what the correct answer is. Yeah, but definitely there's no problem from a metabolic perspective skipping meals.
What about a longer term fast? People that are doing these 3, 4, 5 day fast, what happens then from a metabolic perspective?
So I think out to 2 to 3 days, I've seen a little bit of science that actually shows there's no problem with that. And that may be, again, beneficial if you're doing it once every 6 months or so, to actually help kind of kickstart and regenerate your body well. The longer term fasts, again, Jason Fung, who I'm about, he suggests doing longer fasts, but I think there has to be some protein loss as you go into a longer fast, and to me that concerns me. So it's not something that we have found useful in our clinic. We generally try and get people onto 1 meal a day with a 2 to 3 day fast, maybe every 6 months.
Yeah.
But for us, it's much more about what people eat than the time frames of when they eat.
Talk a little bit about that from a macronutrient perspective, because there seems to be, over the course of time, that certain macronutrients come in and out of fashion, whether it's carbohydrate or fat or otherwise. From a keto diet perspective, what's the makeup of macronutrients?
Okay, so the first thing is you have to restrict your carbs. All right, and we generally start at 50 grams a day of carbs.
And just elaborate a little bit more on that for people that think that carbs is just pasta and bread.
Yeah, so it's anything like salad, vegetables, any green leafy vegetables, although we don't restrict people. If you're really metabolically unwell, if you're super insulin resistant, even a green leafy vegetable needs to be limited how much of that you can eat.
So what do they eat?
Lots of fat and some protein.
Yeah, and fat in what kind of forms? What kind of fats?
We don't really differentiate whether it's saturated or unsaturated, as long as it's not a PUFA or polyunsaturated, seed vegetable oil type thing. So 50 grams a day of carbs, 1 gram per kilogram of healthy body weight per day of protein. Remember that, for example, meat is 20% protein. So let's say you weigh 70 kilograms, let's say you should weigh 70 kilograms.
Yeah.
So we're going to give you 70 grams of protein, which is about 350 grams of steak or fish as your allotment during the day.
Yeah.
Now this is loose numbers. You can go down to 0.7, you can go up to, 1.5, 2, depending on what your exercise requirements are. But there's probably not much benefit going over 2 or even 4 grams per kilogram per day of ideal body weight of protein. And everything else needs to be fat. So, whether you're having butter, whether you're having vegetable oil, and remember that what you can do as well is when you eat your meat, you get the fattiest cut of meat that you possibly can.
Yeah.
When you eat your fish, for example, salmon, you're going to eat the salmon skin because that's where the most of the fat is.
This scares the shit out of people, because it's so counterintuitive to everything. Anyone over 30 years of age has been taught that fat gives you cholesterol and makes you fat and ultimately gives you a heart attack.
And I think the science doesn't back that up. We've now got plenty of studies to show that that's not the case. I'm not a cardiologist. If you're worried about your heart, talk to a cardiologist who's advanced enough to understand this. But, my reading of the science as an orthopedic surgeon and as a scientist doesn't worry me. I'm confident enough with this to put my family on it, to put myself on it, and for my wife to be on it. I have complete confidence with it. I've changed my eating completely to eat this way.
Yeah, but back to the conspiracy theory that we talked about before, there was that expose that the New York Times did in 2016 where they came out and showed evidence that for almost 5 decades, the sugar industry had fundamentally changed the course of what they believe caused heart attacks, and that fat was blamed over sugar, when the entire way along they knew that it was the inflammatory effects of sugar that was largely causing heart attacks. And yet for 50 odd years, we had Harvard professors that were on the payroll, basically forging research, and we had a generation of people that ate a certain way. You know, that's a little bit frightening, and that's a little bit more than a conspiracy theory. That's a proven fact.
It is, and what we're trying to do is change it from the ground up. You know, we're really trying to talk to patients on an individual basis and say to them, look, this is what we've seen, this is what we believe, and this is how we think you should do things.
Yep. What about the old checkup from the neck up and that connection between sugar and fat and the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala and the different parts of the brain that drive eating habits and things? Is there any science around what we eat and that vicious cycle that can come into play with people?
Yeah, so there certainly is. Dopamine receptors are kind of the pleasure receptors in the brain. And when we eat sweet things particularly, we get a dopamine release. And so that makes us want to eat more of them. And this is the difference, I guess, between glucose and fructose, which we haven't really discussed. So table sugar, which is sucrose, is a combination of glucose and fructose put together. Now, fructose, many people have heard of high fructose corn syrup, which is a problem in the US. But our sugar is 50% fructose, which is just as bad as the high fructose corn syrup. Fructose is twice as sweet as what glucose is. So it drives the desire for more sweetness twice as much as what glucose does. And this is why fruit is so dangerous for us, because when we eat fruit, it's mainly fructose. And we can eat the fructose, get the pleasure sensation in our brain from the fructose, and it doesn't make you feel full. You think about when fruit came out twice a year, just before winter, you'd want to make yourself as fat as possible. A bear hibernating, what does it do? It eats fruit because it makes itself fat. You made yourself as fat as you possibly could just before winter. In winter, food was scarce, so you were often starving for long periods of time. And so you'd burn off all the fat that you got from the fruit during winter time. But we're in constant summer now. We can get fruit all year round, and we can eat fruit all year round. So that then means that we're constantly putting on weight and eating fruit and getting fat rather than having lean times. So the brain receptors actually down-regulate in fatter people. So the fatter you are, the less of this dopamine response you actually get in your brain. So you have to eat more to get the same pleasure sensation. So it's actually a self-fulfilling prophecy or a vicious cycle, if you like. The fatter you get, the more you're going to eat to get that same pleasure sensation.
What's the best way for people in that predicament to break that vicious cycle? Like, it literally is going with the help of a professional onto a ketogenic diet typically? Yeah,
because you need support, and you need to be in a almost a group support environment where you can talk to other people about, look, I really feel like having an ice cream now. But it's, phone a friend and they'll say to you, no, don't do it. Stay strong, because the addiction takes about 60 days to get rid of. And it does take nearly 2 full months. And I experienced this myself. I used to eat a lot of lollies when I was doing all my computer work at nighttime. And I found that I had cravings when I changed over. I understood the science. I understood what was happening. To me, and I understood how to break it. And I'm not someone that is easily swayed. When I decide to do something, it's not easy to change my direction. Even I had trouble not breaking and going back to the sugar. And if you've already got other reasons, if you're comfort eating, if you're doing it for other reasons, you really need support to help you through it.
The difference between doing it as a vegetarian, vegan, and doing it with meat, is it more challenging to stay in ketosis on a vegan program than it is on a meat one?
Vegan, definitely. Vegetarian, it can be done. But, this is a big but, you're going to be eating a lot more omega-6 foods in order to achieve that as a vegetarian.
Which includes what? Things like?
Tofu particularly is
so lots of soy-based stuff?
Lots of soy-based stuff and a lot more of the vegetable seeds. Seeds are particularly high in omega-6s.
Yeah.
A lot more nuts as well. Almonds are quite high in omega-6s as well. So there's a trade-off between the health benefits of dropping your omega-6s versus whether you believe there's perceived benefits in doing it as a vegetarian.
Yeah.
As a vegan, we see lots and lots of vegans with major nutritional deficiencies who aren't adequately eating all the right minerals and nutrients that they need. And a lot of people that when they get sick as vegans come and see someone in the clinic and they eventually change their way. Now, it's hard because some people do the veganism and the vegetarian from an ethical perspective, not from a health perspective. Yeah. And you have to respect people that want to do that.
Of course.
And so they can do it. But it's definitely adding a major degree of difficulty to the diet by adding that.
What are the big things that they miss out on? B12, vitamin D,
copper, zinc,
the trace stuff,
B12, and magnesium. There's a whole lot of things that are very, very difficult. We've had a couple of patients basically almost come in with rickets that have needed replacement therapy for that.
Yeah, it's not only in the layperson. Like there's a lot of really well documented doctors like Chris Kresser that I'm sure you're aware of, and some of these very high profile supporters and teachers of paleo diets and things. Like those people found this way through their own illness on a vegan diet. So I always find it interesting that people seem to be very binary, and I get, like you say, that certain people do it for whether it's animal welfare, and whether that's actually true or not is not my position to say, but they do it without actually understanding the real science behind what it takes to live with optimal health.
But the other thing is, not every diet's going to work for every person.
Back to N=1.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so for that particular person, maybe they don't tolerate the protein from the animal.
Very rare though, Doron.
I agree, but there's billions of people in the world, so there may be hundreds of thousands of people that it is better for them to be that way. Personally, it doesn't work for me, and I don't think it works for my patients, but I would never tell someone you can't eat that way.
I've never met a healthy looking vegetarian. Putting it out there.
Yep.
And I know a bunch of them. I lived in Bondi a long time, and there's a lot of vegans and vegetarians there. I've never met one that looks, acts, feels balanced and healthy all the time. Like
sure, but
all of
a
my
lot of them
friends,
will tell you how good they feel.
Yeah.
So
true.
Again,
Truth is in the pudding. Me, more granularly, like the difference between pasture-fed and grain-fed. And again, this is something that I chatted about with Pete last week. How big a difference does it play being pasture-fed from an omega-3 and omega-6 perspective?
Massive. Let's just take it back a step though. If you're going from eating processed foods to eating meat, I don't think it makes a big difference to you.
It's an improvement, massive improvement.
Yeah. So for those people that are going from eating packets of rubbish where you can't identify the food, if they're transitioning over to meat, well done. Don't stress if you can't afford the more expensive meat, because you've already made a huge improvement.
Yeah.
Now, for those that can afford the improvement and grass-fed, unfortunately, is a really bad term, because it's not the grass feeding that's the problem, it's the grass finishing that's the problem. Because if you look at the time frame that the cattle are in the feedlots and are given the grains, it's the last sort of 150 days or so that you have massive, almost from high levels down to 0 drops of omega-3s in the meat.
Yeah.
And that's been studied quite well with actual meat
So
biopsies.
they go from being grass-fed the vast majority of their life, where their omega-3s are very high.
Correct.
Go to the feedlot for the last 100 to 300 days, whatever it happens to be, and those omega-3s basically disappear and are replaced by omega-6s.
Correct.
Yeah.
So again, if you're looking for the the majority effect of anti-inflammatory, if you're looking for the benefits of an anti-inflammatory diet, then by eating grass-fed, grass-finished meat, you're going to get all the benefits of the omega-3s.
Yeah, but when you say grass finished, that just means they stay in the paddock their whole life.
Correct. So they're not fed grains because the grains are the problem.
What about the kind of the hybrid of that, this free range protocol that some farms have now, where the animals remain in the paddock, but they have the option of eating grass, or there's grain available to them? Is that just a sneaky way of labeling meat?
Yes.
Yeah. So same effect.
Yes, it's the grain that's the problem. Cows are not meant to eat grain.
Yeah.
Right?
They're ruminants, and
they are.
Yep.
Yeah, so if you want to fatten them up, you make them insulin resistant by giving them grains. It's the grains and the carbohydrates make us fat and make the cows fat.
Yeah.
But that's not what they're meant to be eating.
From a strict health perspective and a ketogenic perspective, different types of meat more beneficial than others insofar as getting people into that ketogenic state?
The higher the fat, the better.
Yeah.
So, when I'll often go out with friends of mine who don't, believe in what I'm doing, and if we order a steak, they'll cut the fat off and I'll take it off their plates and I'll eat it.
Yeah, me too.
So the fattier the cut of meat, the better. So chicken breast, nowhere near as beneficial as chicken thigh or a chicken leg with the skin on it. A fish with the skin on it. The meat with the fattiest cut of meat. You know way more about meat than what I do.
Yeah.
But when I go shopping, I look for the fattiest cuts of meat. And I also then, the next stage after grass-fed, grass-finished is the organic biodynamic stage. And then, that adds a massive difference, because if it's all very well that you've got a grass-fed, grass-finished cow, but if that cow's eating pesticides, the pesticides get into the fat and the meat. And then I'm going to eat that, I'm going to ingest it, and I'm eating the pesticides. So again, that's the next stage. If you can't afford the organic biodynamic stuff without any pesticides on the soil as well as in the feed, then go to the grass-fed, grass-finished. If you can't afford that, go to regular meat. It's still better than eating processed foods.
But and the whole affordability piece is an interesting one, because one of our underlying philosophies, which is always interesting, that we want people to eat less meat, but we want them to eat better quality. That if you actually do start eating 100 gram, 150 gram premium grade pasture-fed organic steak, it probably costs you the same as that grain-fed, non-organic 600 gram T-bone that you're buying from IGA or Coles. And that paradigm shift of, back to what we were talking about before with the psychological hunger that everyone has, that you're actually satiated, that you get used to eating less because it's got more nutrients in it anyway. And it just takes time for you to realize that a big meal doesn't necessarily fill you up. It's just calories in.
Yeah, look, I think to some extent that is true, and you'll certainly get a lot more of the nutrients and vitamins, particularly in the fat, because there's a lot of fat-soluble vitamins. And if you can get your meat to be more nutritious and more stacked with vitamins, that's true. We have to be a bit careful, because you do have a minimum protein requirement, and as you get older, your protein requirements actually increase to maintain your muscle mass. So you can't drop your protein too much and still maintain your muscle mass.
But
so
proteins in everything,
balance.
Proteins in vegetables and different things too, correct?
Not much.
Not enough?
Not much.
Yeah.
So I mean, there's in dairy, there's a certain amount of protein, but at the end of the day, the protein sources really are things like chicken, fish, meat, duck, poultry. Any of the other true animal protein sources. It's very hard for us. I mean, you can use things like pea protein, but there's a trade-off that comes with a certain amount of carbohydrates, and it usually comes with a certain amount of omega-6s as well. And to make it palatable, they'll often put an artificial sweetener into it as well. And that's another whole discussion point.
It's a really interesting discussion point, because we're exploring, and fascinated by this onset of plant-based meat and cell-based meat. And yesterday, that Beyond Meat, which is a US company that Bill Gates and a raft of very wealthy people have invested in, and it's almost biomimicking using plant-based. And so we went, and there's a burger place over at Glebe, Soul Burger. We'll give them a plug too, because they were really lovely. And we went and ate the burger. But it's the same thing. I'm sitting there questioning. One, it didn't taste that good anyway. Like, it's certainly better than the old bland veggie burger that you got. But it certainly wasn't a Black Angus burger that of some of the things that we make. But I was just sitting there going, what else have you put into this? And I know for a fact that it's made from pea protein is the underlying thing, but they also use a lot of wheat. They also use a lot of soy. And I didn't know what else was in there, versus when we make a burger patty, the only thing that's in there is meat. Nothing else, no sweeteners, no mixes, no spices, nothing whatsoever. And I think people get very binary that plant-based burger is healthy for me than a beef burger. And understanding and digging deeper is a really important part of really, if you really want to be healthy, of understanding that.
No, I agree completely. And learning how to read a nutrition label was something that I learned like 5 years ago. It was not something I ever knew beforehand, because I'd read at the front of the packet and it might say healthy. The classic example is a lot of the almond milks. It's an organic, no cane sugar added almond milk, and then you turn it over and you see that what's added to the almond milk is agave syrup. Now, agave syrup is like 70% fructose. So we talked about already the inflammation caused by fructose and the ongoing desire for more sweet things by the fructose. Yeah. So you now know, despite the fact that it's organic almond milk, it's really, really unhealthy from a cravings perspective and from an inflammation perspective. So you really need to learn to turn your product over, read the label, and understand what's in it, what's been added to it. Yeah. And that's the danger with a lot of these. Again, it's a processed food. It may look like meat, but it's been processed to be that way. And if I can't look at it and understand exactly where it came from, I don't like eating it.
Yeah, it's one of the best pieces of advice that I've ever heard is don't eat anything that comes in a package. That it's the only true way as a Westerner that lives in a city is don't buy packaged food. Obviously meat and things come with the cryovac and things, but I mean truly processed, including almond milks and soy milks and all those kinds of things.
Yeah. So the one exception probably is tinned fish, and then you've got to be careful that your fish is tinned in olive oil, not something like canola oil or one of the other seed oils. But when I tell people go to the supermarket, I say if there's power and refrigeration, you can buy that food, right? And if there isn't, don't buy it. So basically stick to the very edge of the supermarket where the walls are, because that's where the power is. And that's where the fresh produce is, right? And that's the stuff that you're going to buy. You're going to buy your milk, cheese, meat, fish, all that sort of stuff. And don't go down. And if something can sit on a shelf for 3, 6, 12 months without going off, probably you don't want to eat it.
The fish is an interesting one. It doesn't get nearly the attention that land-based protein gets. But my understanding, particularly with the increasing farming of fish, that most of those fish are fed grain too, correct?
They are. And so it does significantly reduce their omega-3 levels. But even with that, the omega-3s are still really beneficial because just fish are so good for you that it's still worthwhile eating that product. It's not as good as if you could get wild caught, but it is still really, really worthwhile.
Which ones in particular, Doron, are the best fish to eat?
You want fatty fish. So generally things like, salmon is basically your best option, really. Yeah. The fattier the fish and the fattier the cut of the fish, the better it is. White fish, again, it's great from a protein perspective, but, if I have a piece of white fish, at the end of that meal, I'm still hungry. I have a piece of salmon with skin on it. At the end of the meal, I'm not hungry.
Because of the fat content.
Correct. Yeah, the fat gives me the satiety.
There's so much literature out there. There's so much research, and whatever side of the argument you sit on, you can convince yourself with science sometimes, not necessarily the best science, but how do people make sense of, I hear so much and they almost get flabbergasted going, my God, I spent 10 years being on a low-fat diet and eating carbohydrates and cereals because that's what all the scientists told me. Now I've got this amazingly intelligent doctor talking to me about eating no carbohydrates and eating predominantly fat. How do you convince people? Not convince is probably the wrong word. How do you teach them to shift through and actually find the good science that's really going to support them, not just for the next year or two, but for the rest of their lives?
The first thing is you can never force people to change their diet. They have to want to change. And so most of the people that are coming to us are motivated for some reason or another. For me, it's easy most of the time because the people, for example, the knee arthritis patients are looking to avoid an operation. And I say to them, look, you've tried all of this. You've been to Weight Watchers, Jenny Craig, all of these things. It hasn't worked for you. You did Light-N-Easy. It worked well. As soon as you went back on regular food, you put all the weight back on again. Do you want to try something different because nothing else has worked for you? And they go, sure. And they say, is it safe? Well, I say, well, I'm doing it. My family's doing it. So do I believe it's safe? Yes, I believe it's safe. What's the worst that could happen? After 3 months or 6 months, if you're not happy, you can go back to how you were eating beforehand. Yeah. So, for me, it's not that difficult for that. It's people that where their husband, wife, whoever it is says, look, you have to go and do this. Those are the difficult people to deal with because they're not motivated to change anyway.
Of course.
Yeah. So after that, we then, we're building resources. So the Low Carb Doctors website has a bunch of videos that Paul Mason and myself and our dietitians and other people have given lectures around the place and things like this podcast where we're trying to share the science, trying to educate people as much as we can. To say to them, look, don't believe us. Here's the science. Read it for yourself. We've simplified it for you. Now make your own decision about whether you think it's safe or not. And it's not going to work for everybody. This is not a panacea for every single person. But society is getting sicker and fatter. And for the huge majority of people, this is a great way of doing things.
Yeah. And I think that the other big challenge for a lot of people is that there's some really hysterically made documentaries, things like What the Health and Cowspiracy and the like, that they brainwashed is the wrong phrase for it, but they get very passionate about veganism in particular. And the science has been debunked many times, but it's very hard to bring people back from that they sometimes lose years of their lives doing these health protocols that aren't necessarily founded on science. And again, I'll caveat that by saying that it's probably better than what they were doing before, so what's the real harm in it? But I think back to what you were saying then, people need to start going to where the science is and then also where the anecdotal evidence is too, that it's working.
Yeah, but the science in nutrition is very, very hard to follow because you can change what you think the outcome should be in the way you design the study.
Health bias.
Yeah, and not only that, but if you read some of the science, some of the lectures that I've given, I've read the title of the paper in the abstract and the conclusion. And if I stopped there, I would come to one conclusion. But then I've actually read the scientific paper and the results that they have reported are different from the conclusion that they've drawn at the end of the paper. And so it's not good enough just to read the headline of it. You really need to get into the nitty-gritty and understand, hang on a second, you've said this, but that's not actually what your paper showed.
Yeah, fascinating.
Yeah. And so editorial boards, there's a whole lot of other, layers on layers on layers. But it's very easy to lose yourself down a rabbit hole that way. We try and keep things as simple as possible. This is the science of the really important stuff.
Yeah.
This is the stuff that's going to work for most people. This is what we stick to. Now, we're interested in the other stuff, so we personally go down these other rabbit holes, but we generally don't take the patients with us just because it's too confusing.
Yeah. What's the best outcome you've had with one of your patients insofar as your brother you spoke about before from an asthma and a weight loss perspective, but have you had any remarkable results from a disease perspective?
So look, Paul really is the one to deal with that. He's the one that deals face to face with these patients on a day-to-day basis.
I'll ask him then.
Yeah. So I know because I discuss all of this. He and I have a very close relationship. We discuss the patients, the science, all that kind of stuff. Yeah. And there really have been remarkable things. But one of the really consistent things that happens again and again and again is people get off all of their diabetes medication if they're a type 2 diabetic, and they get off all of their blood pressure medication if they've got blood pressure. And we see that consistently and reproducibly. Type 1 diabetics are somewhat different because they're always going to need some insulin because they're not making any of their own. But we've had people that have been on, increasing doses of tablets and injections who within 3 to 6 months are basically off pretty much all of their medications, which is a real life changer for them.
It's exciting, man.
Yeah,
it's really exciting.
It is.
Doron, thanks for coming on, my friend.
Oh, thanks for having me here.